Now, when Erikson was talking about the first stage of development, the trust versus mistrust, specifically what he was trying to talk about is the importance of parents responding to their infant's needs. And if parents do consistently respond to those child's needs, then they'll come to trust their parents and trust other people and feel just more secure in general. If the parents fail to be consistent, if they make mistakes in their parenting, then the child will learn to mistrust others. And Erikson argued that with the proper balance of trust and mistrust, these infants will acquire what he calls hope. Hope is this openness to experience, tempered by wariness that occurs when there's a balance between trust and mistrust. That might sound a little strange, like why would you want to have some mistrust? Why would you want it to balance like that? And the basic way to think about it is you don't want somebody to be trusting of everyone all the time. They need to learn to be a little mistrusting about strangers, for example. They need to not be gullible, so to say. So that's the first stage that Erikson was talking about. And the second stage is what we call autonomy versus shame and doubt. What he was saying here is that children learn to control themselves. They need to learn how to do things on their own. This leads them to this desire to want to try to do things independently. However, this drive for autonomy is going to be counteracted by them doubting their skills and the shame that might result from their failure. So when this child's desire for autonomous behavior, the potential of shame and doubt, when these things are all in balance, then this gives rise to what he calls the will. This child's understanding that he or she can make a difference in the world. And while there might be some risk, they can, deal with that kind of risk. And then the third stage that Erikson was talking about in his theory of development is initiative versus guilt. So this is where children start to take some responsibility for themselves. They start to identify with their parents and explore their world and the people in it. And this initiative is moderated by guilt that they have as these children realize over time that what they want, their goals, their dreams, they sometimes might clash with other people. They might be doing harm, or they might just be inconveniencing other people when they try to pursue these goals. So this guilt that they have for, causing problems for other people, if that guilt is balanced well with their own initiative, then this will give rise to what Erikson called a purpose, a sense of purpose, a balance between these two things, initiative and guilt. And just refers to a willingness to cooperate with others. So here's those first three stages that I was just describing, the crises that we see in each stage, and what develops, the strength that develops during that stage. So these are the years we're focusing on right now. Those early developmental stages where really important milestones are met. This is the age of a child's life which is going to, for a large extent, shape all their future relationships. Attachment to the caregivers, whether they're parents, grandparents, or whatever, attachment to those caregivers is critical, and especially during the first year of life. Because like I said, this early relationship, this first relationship, is going to be like the prototype relationship. It's going to be the basis for all relationships that follow. And obviously, because it's so incredibly important, you need to make sure that that is a healthy relationship. But before we get to what makes a good relationship and how to judge the quality of that relationship, I just want to take a little bit of a tangent here. So We talk about evolutionary psychology time to time when it comes to subjects like this because evolutionary psychology, remember, this isn't just the science of, evolution isn't just about how birds' wings get bigger and, teeth get sharper. Evolution also applies to behavior. So evolutionary psychology then is this belief that our present day behaviors are the result of successful adaptations to our environment. So the way we interact now, the relationships we have today, and how we develop those relationships, these are skills that have been shaped gradually over the course of uncountable years. So just as time went on, the way you could think about it is, as time went on, humans that could cooperate better, humans that could trust each other better, they were more likely to survive. They were more likely to have offspring of their own. So those more pro-social kinds of traits were selected by the environment. And we are the descendants of those individuals. It's evolutionarily advantageous to cooperate. So that's what we have learned to do. That's what many species actually have learned to do. Alright, so sorry about that little tangent. Going back to the early relationship that these infants have, one famous researcher in this regard is John Bulby. He talked about the 4 stages of attachment. The pre-attachment stage, which occurs during the 6th to 8th week. This is when the child starts showing evidence of being able to recognize the mother by smell or sound. And then we have attachment in the making, which occurs between the 2nd and 8th month, where the child will start to act differently around their parents and prefer them over others. Then true attachment comes at about 8 to 18 months of age. This is when children will begin to identify their primary caregiver and seek them out when they're scared or concerned. And then true, like a more adult-like reciprocal relationships don't begin until at least 18 months. So this is when the child will take some initiative in the relationship. They'll start, initiating conversations, they'll initiate exchanges and interactions, and they'll just interact in more meaningful ways with their caregiver. So John Bulby is somebody we talk about quite a lot when it comes to, these early milestones. And when we look at the kinds of early relationships children form, what we generally see is that the first relationship and the most significant relationship for many children is with the mother. So the mother is like not only the first, but also she's like a source of comfort. She's a source of security. The father usually comes second. So attachment to fathers is shortly after the mother. And that relationship with the father is fundamentally different. Fathers tend to spend a lot more time playing with the child instead of, taking care of them. The mother is more so like the caregiver, the person who cooks the meals and, cleans the boo-boos and all that kind of stuff. Whereas dad is more so the one who's going to play and do rough and tumble and things like that. In general, fathers do play quite differently from mothers. It's a lot more roughhousing. Mothers are much more likely to just sit quietly and play, gentle games, or just talk to the child or read with the child. So the consequence of this parenting difference that we typically see is that children, when they want to have fun, they're going to go to dad. Dad is the fun parent, usually. Whereas if they're scared, or if they're hungry, or if they're just upset, they tend to go for the mother. The mother is the comforting parent. Now, one really important, I guess you could call him like a student or coworker of Bulby, was Mary Ainsworth. And she did a lot of research into how we could assess these early relationships children are forming. She developed what we call the strange situation. It's like a situational judgment test. And it occurs in three phases. This is the standard way to do it, but you can do variations on this. So the first phase, the child and the mother enter like a small playroom. There's a one-sided mirror so the researchers can watch what's happening. And the mother and child, they sit down in this playroom and they just play for a few minutes. Then, after a short period of time, the mother is signaled to leave the room. And the researchers, they're standing behind the glass watching what's happening this whole time, taking notes. And then, after the mother leaves the room, after a short period of time, the mother is signaled to return to the room. All right, so those are the three phases. Mother and child play together, mother leaves, mother returns. And they record what happens during each of these three phases. And depending on the pattern of behavior they see across those three phases, they will be able to judge how healthy the relationship is. And they identified 4 basic patterns. One is the healthy pattern, and the other 3 are different kinds of unhealthy patterns. So, the 4 types of attachment are secure attachment. We see that in about 60 to 65% of all infant caregiver relationships. So, what we generally see is that when the parent leaves, the baby's probably going to cry. It's not necessarily going to happen, but the baby might cry. Now, whether or not the baby cries, when the mother returns, they will show signs of wanting to be with her, and they will stop crying, and they will calm down. So the child is instantly comforted by the return of the parent. Now, the most common unhealthy or insecure kind of attachment is called avoidant. We see that in about 20% of infant caregiver relationships. So this is where the baby doesn't seem to care about the mother's leaving the room. And when the mother returns, they don't care either. It's kind of like the infant is just completely detached from this mother figure or caregiver. They just don't seem to mind whether she's coming or going. So that's a bad sign, as I said. That's an unhealthy sign. They're not developing good relationship skills. That's what that means. Then the next most common is called resistant attachment. You see this at about 10 to 15% of infant caregiver relationships. So this is where the infant will show signs of distress. They'll become very upset when the caregiver leaves. But interestingly, they will remain upset when the caregiver returns. And often they will remain upset for an extended period of time. It's almost as if this infant is trying to punish that caregiver for leaving in the first place. And then finally, we have disorganized attachment. And this one's a little bit hard to explain because it can manifest in a few different ways. But we only see this at about 5 to 10% of infant caregiver relationships. So what we basically see here is that when the caregiver leaves and returns, the infant just doesn't seem to know how to react. Like, they don't necessarily seem upset, but they certainly don't seem comfortable either. The baby just seems to be confused in general. So they often will act in contradictory ways. When the mother returns, they might start crawling towards the mother, but they won't look at the mother. They won't, show any signs of recognizing the mother. They'll just want to be near them. So, like I was saying, these early life relationships, these first relationships children form, typically with the mother, have some pretty profound consequences. Children who develop a secure attachment to this parent will generally, we've done a lot of longitudinal studies on this and found that they generally have higher quality friendships later in life and fewer conflict in the various relationships they do have compared to those children who show signs of insecure attachment. And just in general, children with insecure attachments, they tend to have more emotional problems, more like mental health issues, like issues with anger, aggression, and anxiety. And that obviously is going to play a big role in their adult relationships. But I'm not trying to make you freak out. Like if you have a young baby or if you've recently had a little baby, I'm not trying to freak you out. I don't want to stress you out. I mean, it is incredibly important to develop a good relationship with this new person, but at the same time, it's not always going to be up to what you do. Sometimes you're just in a bad situation. Sometimes the environment can just stress out the mother and the infant and damage that early attachment, and it's not really anybody's fault. It's just a bad situation. So it's not entirely up to what the parents do regarding the quality of this attachment. But there are obviously things you can do to try to help ensure that you do develop a good, secure attachment to your baby. The most important thing is to be responsive. Responsive parenting will reassure the child, make them feel comforted. Now, when I say responsive parenting, I don't mean that you are giving them everything they want. What I mean is you're not ignoring them. You're interacting with them. You're showing them that you care. Another important thing is to be predictable. Be consistent. If you say you're going to do something, do it. And continue to do it every time. Like they need to be able to develop what we call an internal working model. These set of expectations about what a parent is and how relationships should work. And this internal working model will, alter their perspective on relationships throughout life. But as I said, it's not entirely up to what the parent does. It's not entirely up to the parent's behavior. Sometimes children just have difficulty. They're born with these temperaments, these genetic predispositions to be a certain way, and that could conflict with the parent. But we can't change a child's genetics after they're born. But what we can do is we can help parents learn better techniques. Parental training can help parents to just better focus their energies and get the kinds of results that they're looking for. Now, on a side note, a lot of parents are concerned about the attachment to their child nowadays because they don't get to see their child very often. They have to spend a lot of time at work with their child in daycare or something like that. That's pretty common nowadays, especially with most families having to have both parents work, either full or part-time. And many parents are concerned about that. I mean, it's a valid concern. You're worried that your relationship with this child could suffer. But just to reassure you a little bit, studies have been done that have shown that this relationship is not necessarily going to be affected by putting your child in daycare and not getting to see them very often, because for the child, they recognize that the relationship with you is important and it's different. So they focus on the interactions they have with you, and if you're not always around because, work and whatnot, that's not necessarily going to count against you. It is important that when you're with them, you spend good quality time with them, but you don't have to be with them 24/7, is what I'm saying. So when it comes to daycare, you don't need to worry about the quality or the length of the stays, the number of changes from one daycare to the next. You don't need to worry about the age when your child begins the daycare or the type of daycare it is, or whether or not the child forms relationships with the workers there. Like, these things don't seem to be related to the relationship you form with your own child. But there is some important things to consider if you do decide to put your child in daycare. Not all daycares are equally good. Some are much better than others, and it can at times be difficult to find out which daycare would be best. Sometimes you just have to go with the most convenient one, but if you do have the ability to make a decision, here's what you should look for. You want to find these kinds of factors when it comes to a high quality childcare. First of all, there's a small number of children per caregiver, and this scales to the age. So if we're talking about like newborns, it should be like 2 to 1, 2 newborns to 1 caregiver. But as they get older to like 3 or 4 years old, now it can be like 4 to 1 or 5 to 1. And it just keeps going up from there. But the smaller the ratio, the better in general. Also, you want to make sure that these caregivers are well trained and responsive. Before you sign any papers, just talk to them and maybe even go online and read reviews about this particular childcare and just try to figure out what their credentials are, what their history is. You want to make sure that they know what they're doing. The third thing is you want to make sure that they are engaging your child in age-appropriate activities, that they have intellectually stimulating things for the children to do. And the fourth thing, and personally this is the thing I consider incredibly important from my own experiences, is the caregivers need to be able to communicate with the parents effectively. If something happens at the daycare that affects the child and they don't tell you about it, that could cause a lot of problems. That could be potentially grounds for like a legal action. So it's very important that these caregivers, write reports about any incidents that might occur, or just give you feedback in general, even if nothing serious happens, just letting you know, what the child did, what the child ate, that kind of stuff. So the better the communication they have, the better the daycare it is. And one interesting thing about daycares that I think is really cool is we're seeing more and more employers recognize the importance of providing daycare for their employees. So for many companies, if you get a job for one of these many companies, they might actually offer you a discount, or in some cases even like free or on-site daycare. So you could just take your child to work, put him in daycare, and when you're done with your shift, you could just pick him up and go home. So we're seeing that become a lot more popular as time goes on. And just like I was saying, just in general, you don't need to worry about putting your child in a daycare, but you should certainly look for these quality factors before you do.